Okay, good. All right, welcome. Welcome everyone to the HiFlex Design, Modalities and Mindsets for Planning. We're thrilled to have Robin DeRosa and Martha Burtis with us today. You may remember Robin from having done some other webinars for OACC and perhaps at your own community colleges. The session today is 90 minutes long. I am Lori Zakel. I'm the lead faculty engagement coach for OACC, and prior to that, I worked at Sinclair for over 35 years. If during this session, we'll have time for questions at the end where you can unmute yourself and ask a question live if you want to, or you can put your questions in the chat and I will monitor the chat to see if there are some questions that need to be asked a little bit earlier, which I'm happy to do on anyone's behalf. Again, Robin and Martha will be talking to us about HiFlex design, specifically with regard to teaching and learning. And a lot of this is information learned from COVID teaching during COVID and mapping opportunities for the future. I'm going to give you a little bit of information about both of them. Robin and Martha join us from Open Learning and Teaching Collaborative at Plymouth State University in New Hampshire, where they don't yet have as much snow as we do, but it's coming, I guess. Robin is known for her work in open education and for building academic programs that foreground flexibility and learner-driven curriculum. Martha designs digital environments for education and specializes in creating online spaces that nurture student agency and creativity. Since COVID, they've been working on helping faculty and institutions develop more flexible approaches to teaching, and they were recognized by Berlin Science Week for the 2020 Breakthrough of the Year in digital education for this work. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Robin and Martha.
Thanks, Lori, and thanks everybody for having us. We are very happy to be here. It does feel, I'm actually looking through the names, like a few of you are becoming more familiar, so it's good to see some faces and names that I've seen before. We definitely did leave a good chunk of time at the end for question and answers. So the thing I would really appreciate is if you do have a question, don't lose track of it, like pop it in the chat or just remember it, because we do have this time for conversation. And I think we're a good sized group that we can actually, sort of unmute and just talk together and maybe really tackle some of the questions that you might have. So I am happy to be here talking with you about HiFlex design, a great idea that someone once had. So we're going to talk about how that's worked out and what ways we might adjust it. And I'm going to start by talking a little bit about solutions. Really, I think a technology-based solution is probably only helpful if you have a technology-based problem. So for example, if your problem is such and such tech tool that I'm using in this class isn't working, we can talk about that and focus on the technology and come up with a solution that's probably related to technology. But the question about teaching during something like COVID, the question of whether that's actually a technology problem, I think is one that is highly suspect. But I think for a lot of our campuses, the most obvious part of the COVID dilemma was about modality. It was, okay, if a student can't come to school because it's not safe, or a student has COVID, and a student needs to be remote, that is about online learning and that is about technology. So what do we need to do? So on my campus, what that meant was we needed to get a whole bunch of little cameras and put them in the classrooms so that we could deliver more of our content online. And this was a tweet that came out around the time when many of us were flailing. It may seem familiar to you, that basically you get these emails from your administrators. Please be prepared to teach online, in person, both simultaneously, on a moving train, while juggling in a burning building, blah, 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 T-Rex. And for those of you who did engage in what we call HiFlex learning, there was maybe a fine line between teaching in two modalities at once, both online and face-to-face at the same time, and teaching on the back of a T-Rex, right? Once you really start doing it, you realize Fundamentally, this seems like a really challenging and maybe ridiculous task. So before we talk about HiFlex, I just want to kind of baseline our language. And I'm sort of showing this slide, not because these are the absolute definitions of these different modalities, because on some campuses, people use the word blended to mean what another campus calls hybrid. So it can be very complicated. But for the purposes of today, face-to-face learning is something we really understand. I think blended also, because blended is basically face-to-face that uses rich technologies, multimedia, online as part of your course. So there aren't that many of us who are teaching what this slide calls traditional face-to-face with absolutely no online components in our class at all. So lots of us were already engaged in blended learning. Of course, you all have colleagues who were doing none of that, for whom COVID was a Herculean challenge, right? Because they really were still in the pencil and paper mode of teaching. But for lots of us, we were already doing blended classes. Some of us were doing hybrid classes, which is when you would replace some of what we call seat time with online coursework, whether that online coursework would be synchronous, so you'd be like on Zoom or something, or it would be asynchronous and they just have things they had to do online, and instead of meeting twice a week in person, you meet once a week in person. That would be hybrid. And of course, many of us were already teaching fully online classes, but not necessarily during a global pandemic. We're going to talk about that too. But what I want to say about these four modalities is that HiFlex learning, which is something that was first introduced years ago, far before COVID. But I'm going to guess most people here had never heard of it until COVID, because for the most part, there wasn't a lot of HiFlex practice going on. And HiFlex basically means you teach in both the online and the face-to-face modality simultaneously. So some of your students are online, usually synchronously. So there's a camera capturing your lecture, and the rest of your students are in the classroom with you. And one of the things you may have experienced if you were teaching HiFlex at all during COVID is that those demographics shift in size. So sometimes you may have lots of face-to-face students and only 3 or 4 online because they're quarantining. But as the semester goes, lots of people noticed that when HiFlex was an option, more and more students were taking the online option. So at the end, some faculty in HiFlex modalities had no students in the classroom and everybody was Zooming in. So obviously for COVID, some of this made a lot of sense. And before we get any further, I want to tell you something awkward and personal, but it also changes my relationship to this PowerPoint in a way that's pretty interesting for me, actually, because I am delivering this webinar from, awkwardly, my bed in New Hampshire because I currently have COVID. I was almost to my second shot when I got exposed through a student worker in our collab, and I tested positive. I have to say that because I feel pretty good, thank you, Pfizer, for shot 1. I have been still working. You know, here I am giving a webinar, but Martha and I have been doing our regular work all week long. I'm really grateful for the flexibility that these remote technologies have afforded me to keep doing my work during COVID. I think I'd be even more grateful if I were a student who was trying to keep up in a class, right? Because at times I've also been like, dude, I have COVID, I should be taking some days off, right? But that's just philosophical, I really feel fine. But there's something great about what HiFlex offered to us in terms of the reality of a global pandemic, right? We all believe that sometimes we need to do things during COVID that aren't perfect, but they help us survive a really challenging time. But I think one of the challenges with HiFlex learning is that for people who design for online modalities, we know that the ways that you design for online and the ways that you design for face-to-face are very different. So one of the questions Martha and I want to raise today is how can we rethink HiFlex for a post-COVID university when we're not in an emergency situation all the time anymore? Do we still want to keep delivering things in 2 modalities at once? Or do we want to think about this a little more creatively? there are some great benefits to HiFlex, and Beatty's work on HiFlex, he was sort of the first one to, and we're going to share this slide deck, by the way, and it'll have, some of the links so that you can go out and check, because Beatty's got whole workbooks online about like HiFlex planning and design. And there's some really great principles behind the idea of HiFlex, even before COVID, right? The idea was, first of all, we believe many times in our pedagogy that learner choice is very helpful. So one of the things we talk about in the collab a lot is like when you're doing assignment design, it's helpful to build student choice and voice into your assignments. So Beatty basically said, what if we also thought about choice in terms of modality? Like, why do we always assume that we have to prescribe the modality of the class to our students? We know students learn, some cannot learn at all online. That's what they'll tell you. Others really appreciate the flexibility. What if students had more choice? Equivalency is a really interesting idea. The idea with equivalency is not that online learners and face-to-face learners have to have the exact same activities and experiences in the class, but that they have to lead to equivalent outcomes. This is really familiar, I think, to instructional designers because we're interested in all of the multiplicity of ways that you can come to a standard learning outcome, right? That you don't have to have everybody always doing exactly the same thing. Reusability is interesting, especially to those of us like myself who are interested in open education, because the idea of reusability is that if an online group of students is doing something or a face-to-face group of students are doing something, you try to capture that work. You try to give them an opportunity to share what they've learned. You're recording lectures, and all of this stuff can become artifacts that can then be shared. And that's great for all of the students. Even students who were face-to-face in the lecture may appreciate rewatching that lecture. So the idea of having those artifacts to reshare, you can reshare them the next semester, you can reshare them with the general public. There's all sorts of ways that reusability can be helpful to expanding access to learning. And that brings us to the last one, which is accessibility. The idea here is in HiFlex design, you foreground accessibility so that all students can participate in all of the modes and that all students have the equipment and the expertise that they need to participate in all of the modes. These are really great principles, I think, for HiFlex. And it's one of the things that drew Martha and I to HiFlex when COVID started. We knew we had to do it because we had to offer, these experiences. We were mostly a face-to-face campus, so some students were staying face-to-face, but the principles behind HiFlex were great. The problem is it became more complicated in practice once you really look at those principles. So we're really glad that students can have flexible participation with HiFlex. So when they are engaging with challenges, HiFlex is there to offer them what they need. Now, we know that the big community challenge was COVID, right? It hit us all simultaneously, and that's why it was so very visible. But even before COVID happened, I remember giving a webinar on flexible learning. That's what we were talking about pre-COVID. And I was actually happened to be giving it to us, to the California Community College system, who was at that moment, many of them plagued by wildfires. Many of their campuses had shut down. Many of their students were like essentially refugees fleeing their homes for temporary shelters and that kind of thing. So when we think about HiFlex, it's really not just for global pandemics. It's also for the fact that, and this was something that we were talking about early this morning, Martha and I actually, if you teach human beings, which I think most of us do, the chance that your humans are going to have a trauma or a crisis at some point during their formal education is very high. If I asked you to tell me the last time you really experienced a tragedy in your life, I will hope it will be a very long time. But my guess is it might be in the last 5 or 10 years. What that means is that if your students are going to school for 12, 15, 18, however many years, they are going to face crises, whether they're regional crises like fires or floods, or they are the loss of a parent or a chronic illness of their own. So HiFlex gives us this kind of flexibility. We see from the Beatty values that there's a lot of things that we like about it. So how can we do this without running into some of what we ran into in COVID? And so to talk about that, I want to show this wonderful slide. This was actually an article, and I'll share the article with you in the slide deck, that had the title with this picture, was the headline picture on the article. And the title of the article was, "What is lecture capture and why do students love it?" So lecture capture, if you don't know the fancy term, is just when you record yourself giving a lecture like this dude is doing right here in the picture. And then, you know, your students can watch it at any time. Now, I guess I don't know how many students this author has actually spoken to. I think students appreciate having a recorded lecture, but I don't think there's any students who love it. You know, the students do not watch back these lectures that are usually filmed with really crappy, you know, corner of the room technology. They watch them back, if you don't know this, right? They're watching it back at quadruple speed, right? So you're telling us like because it's so painful, right? To sort of watch this. So lecture capture is helpful if you miss something in a lecture or you're sick for a day, but it's not really designed to be engaging, and it doesn't feel the way it feels when you're sitting in a class with the energy of the people. It's different to watch television than it is to go to a live Broadway play. An example of this, and that's okay that you were good there with Jay Smooth, Martha. This guy he's named Jay Smooth, and he's just one of my internet heroes. But he's a guy who has a YouTube channel where he teaches you stuff. So, for example, he's got a little thing on systemic racism and the wealth gap. It would be a perfect little module for a sociology class, for example. But just compared to the lecture capture image that I just showed you before, when you look at Jay Smooth here, you can tell that this has been produced for you as an online learner, right? He's just sitting there, he's talking to you. There's some graphics there that really already help you get situated to what you're doing, versus the guy in the lecture capture thing who's writing on a whiteboard that you have to squint to even see, right? This is just one of the most basic things that illuminates the problem with HiFlex learning, right? We design differently for online modalities and face-to-face modalities. And you're probably going to make it through a global pandemic with HiFlex learning, but you're not going to win any awards for great pedagogy. So as COVID winds down, we want to think about how can we retain the flexibility, the choice, the values of HiFlex, while honoring the fact that nobody really likes simultaneously teaching in these two different modalities at one time. A way of thinking about this, and some of this comes from Beatty's work, is that when you design for a HiFlex alternative, you are really having to think about 3 modalities, not even 2, because you're thinking about the in-class face-to-face modality. You're thinking about the online synchronous folks who are on Zoom. You know, they're kind of like face-to-face learners, but we already saw it doesn't feel that way. And then thirdly, there are asynchronous students. So many of us with HiFlex realized that, for example, it may not be enough just to let your students Zoom in. If they actually have COVID, or they're actually, you know, dealing with a flood and they had to flee their house and they don't have internet access, they may not be able to get online synchronously. So now you're designing async activities as well. So when you're designing for these 3 different modalities, it's also not just about your content, right? And how to deliver it, because in addition to the actual like facts that you teach, and I am by trade an English professor, so I don't teach any facts, but you know, you've got your content, the meat of what you teach, but you've also got the activities that you design in order to deliver that content and have students interact with it. You've got the communication that surrounds it. So for example, if you have an assignment or something, the assignment doesn't just go into their head by osmosis. Somehow you have to explain it to them and tell it to them. And then when students have trouble, they need support, they need extra help. all 4 of those things have to be threaded through all 3 of the HiFlex modalities, right? So this is why we started during COVID hearing faculty say, oh my God, you're killing me. I'm exhausted. I cannot keep up with this. And not only that, I don't feel like any of these modalities are actually being successful because the students aren't really engaged. So I'm doing triple or quadruple the work for less success with my students. So there are planning guides that will help you. For example, this is one from Beatty that again, will be provided to you, that will help you design HiFlex courses when you have to use them. And I do think there are times for a HiFlex modality, for doing 2 or 3 modalities at one time, especially if you really plan for that and you're able to use these guides to think about your activities, to think about your supports, to think about your content and your communication. But what we started to do in the collab was to think, are there other ways to think about HiFlex? We know that HiFlex works on some level, but some of those very small number of studies that have come out about HiFlex, now there's going to be a lot more studies coming soon, right? But when COVID was just starting, people didn't care that much about HiFlex. So there are a couple studies out there. There's some pretty interesting ones. The Ohio State one basically said, you can deliver your content this way. Students can learn this way. On some assessments, they did equally well, when they were learning in these 2 different modalities. So if you follow the Beatty design guide, you can have enough success with HiFlex to make it through these challenges. But look at some of these University of Nebraska pieces of information I think are really interesting. Students tended to prefer the face-to-face modality both before and after the HiFlex implementation. That is really interesting, that they will tell you they prefer face-to-face learning and then they will corroborate that afterwards. But look at the 3rd bullet there. Students ended up using asynchronous mode more than they expected. What that means is even though they were telling you they want to be sitting in your classroom, when HiFlex is available, they will increasingly use it, right? So what we found at Plymouth State absolutely mirrored this. So students absolutely on actual surveys that we delivered said they want to be face-to-face, they do not want online learning. And then over the course of the semester, literally almost all of our HiFlex oriented professors reported that they had almost 0 attendance face-to-face. Almost everybody was Zooming in. Now, this is easy to understand. For example, if you have a meeting with colleagues and you're really looking forward to seeing them all face-to-face, but you have the option to Zoom in and save yourself the half-hour transit time that it would take to get there, and you can just do it from your living room, lots of us are going to take those options because they are a path of least resistance. So it's important to understand the complexity there with HiFlex in terms of what students say they need and enjoy versus what students will actually do. What it tells us is that flexibility is highly valued by students, but also that sometimes they recognize that it's not always in their best interest for education to be doing it. So it can be complicated. I also want to show that last bullet point to administration because I think it's really interesting. 61% said, they would always like to have every course available HiFlex and they would pay more to have that option available. I think you'll see as Martha and I go on that we are not going to suggest that you HiFlex all your courses and then upcharge your students. But what I am saying is that as we talk about the parts of this that are not successful, let's also recognize that we are getting some clear messages from our students that parts of this are helpful to them. So what we're going to do, which is really the genius of Martha Burtis, is we're going to change HiFlex, the traditional way we talk about that, which stands for hybrid flexible, to HiFlex with an I, which stands for highly flexible. So I'm going to explain HiFlex in the traditional way one more time, and then Martha's going to take it away, kind of rethinking how we might think of HiFlex now that we know a little bit more about its challenges. So again, HiFlex traditionally has been 3 modalities: face-to-face, online synchronous, and online asynchronous, running all at the same time. And the students in pure HiFlex are supposed to be given that option for every class period. They can wake up that morning and decide which of those options they choose. It focuses on modality as a prompt for pedagogical design. So you'll notice that Beatty's, all of his worksheets start with, okay, you're online, start there, here's what we're doing. Okay, you're face-to-face, start there, here's what we're doing. And it sees flexibility as a feature of the modality. The fact that you can change modalities is where the flexibility lives. And the framework for HiFlex learning is basically just technology. Like, that's the whole framework, right? That's the bulk of the training that you get as faculty. It's just about, do you know how to use Zoom? Can you get online? And like at our college, what it looked like was, we have done our duty to support you, faculty. We have given you Zoom cameras in the rooms. Now you are all set. And what Martha and I thought is, especially after we saw that not work so well, is that we need more of a framework to support the shifts that faculty are making in this new kind of learning. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Martha, who's going to talk about highly flexible design.
Thanks, Robin. So when we were grappling over the summer with how to really prepare our faculty as best we could and give them support and resources for the fall semester, that's where this idea of rethinking HiFlex came from. And as Robin said, the idea behind HiFlex with an I is to downplay modality as what it is that we're designing around, and instead highlight flexibility as what we're designing around. Modality still matters, but instead of just saying we're going to do everything for everyone, we encourage faculty to be thinking really intentionally about what different modalities afford and how they can use them towards those affordances really effectively. And embedding the choice of modality into all different parts of the schedule of the course based on how something needs to be taught, based on the content that's being taught, the context, and even the individual needs of learners and students. So there's a bigger focus on the pedagogy and the intentional choice of pedagogy, as opposed to, we just need to figure out a way to duplicate everything we're doing in 3 different ways so that it's equally the same in all those different ways, which is basically impossible. Let me talk a little bit now about what kind of underpinned this for us as we were working with faculty. And I'm going to take you kind of through the story of how this evolved for us at PSU. So starting with the advice we sort of gave to faculty, some of which I think is still really useful advice, but also talking to you a little bit about the lessons that we learned by talking to faculty and seeing how things were playing out in the fall semester here at PSU and into the spring. So the first tenet that we really emphasized was this, that we wanted faculty to start by designing for online. Because in many ways, designing for online was the trickiest piece. And if we could start by saying, just imagine that your class is fully online and you need to be prepared for that, and then backfill from there into, okay, now that you have that, imagine that you have opportunities to have your students face-to-face. What those opportunities look like may be highly variable depending on the local context, what's going on with COVID, what's going on at your institution. So you need to be still flexible in your mindset, but you can really then think about, well, if I have everything online, then how would I really make the best use of those moments when we can be in communion together, when we can be present together? And so this value of designing first for online sort of was at the heart of all of the models that we presented to faculty. The next was to really, when they thought about face-to-face, to think about it as flexibly as possible. And to think about it as a flexible time for different kinds of face-to-face interaction. And I'll talk to you a little bit in a minute about what those different types of interaction could look like. This was just sort of underpinning everything as well, and it's a word that I use a lot when I'm talking about this work, which is intentionality. So rather than sort of what Robin was describing with traditional HiFlex, which is like we gave you Zoom cameras, just do it all. Do everything for everybody in all places, which has no intentionality behind it. We really wanted faculty to for themselves decide, how do these different modalities work for me, work for my content, work for my courses? When do I want to use them and how do I want to use them? And make those choices that they're making, not simply things that have been foisted upon them out of the crisis of the situation. Because we weren't sure what the fall semester was going to bring, I think we have a better sense of what next fall is going to bring, but I would say we still are cautious. We emphasized all along the way that they were going to need to work within the reality of any potential complications, which means they had to be prepared for a second, we hate this word, pivot, because we just knew there was a great possibility that what they had gone through in spring of 20 was going to have to be repeated in some fashion during this academic year. And interestingly, at PSU, we did not have that happen during fall of 20, but we did have it happen this semester. About, I don't know, 3 or 4 weeks into our semester, we had to take courses back fully remote for about 2.5 weeks, I think, Robin. I think that's about right. So we wanted faculty to be thinking a little bit ahead to what that might mean. And finally, with the models that we presented to faculty, we really emphasized that none of these were magical, that these are thought experiments in some way to get them thinking about possibilities, and that really what their job was to look at all of those models and find their way between and among them. So I'm going to take you through these 5 models fairly quickly. 4 of them are, or 3 of them are very much variations upon the same, so we don't need to spend too much time on that. This model actually was not one of our original ones. It kind of came to light for me in talking to faculty at other institutions about how they were doing it. I came across somebody talking about this as the way that they were approaching their teaching last fall. All of these models, I'll just say, have a kind of 2 parts to them, one of which is this focus on online design and what that would look like, and the other one is about face-to-face flexibility and what that could look like. So the alternate day teaching model was basically asking faculty to think very critically about the content that they teach and what material has to be taught face-to-face and what material could be taught online. And then using the face-to-face to really forefront those things that just absolutely critically you feel like you need to be in a space together in order to do that. And because we were having issues here at PSU, I don't know whether this is the case at all of your schools, where our classrooms couldn't accommodate all of our students face-to-face at the same time because of social distancing rules. We were talking about split classes. So the idea here was that a faculty member would literally teach the same class, say, twice a week. They teach it on Monday, they teach it on Wednesday, they teach it on Tuesday, they teach it on Thursday, but to 2 different cohorts of students. And then the other half of the course activity, course material, would be delivered through an online presentation or an online environment. It's a difficult one because I would say all of these models really challenge faculty to think critically about, do I really have to do this thing? Do we really have to cover this thing in the way that I have covered it, forever, however many years I've been teaching this course? Could I do this differently? And is it possible that what I thought had to happen in a face-to-face class could happen through some kind of online interaction instead? And if they could do that, if they could really successfully come up with a kind of a dividing line of those, that could be a really successful model. So again, it's really about teaching half the amount of time, but doing it twice, and using online and face-to-face, again, for very different affordances. These next 3 models, like I said, are all kind of variations on a theme. And again, they're all driven from this notion that students couldn't physically be present necessarily all at the same time, or for reasons such as they might be in quarantine or they might be in isolation, they literally couldn't come to class. So thinking a little bit about, well, what do you do with online and what do you do with face-to-face? And at the heart of all of these were these kind of values for online, which is that making sure that all course materials at least are available without face-to-face interaction, so that it's not absolutely required for a student to come to class to get what they need to succeed. So what does that mean for you within the systems that you have available to you? Considering recording, sharing some version of whatever happens in face-to-face for students who can't be present. And that can look like lots of different things. It doesn't necessarily have to be a 60-minute lecture capture, but creating some sort of assets that come out of those face-to-face interactions that can then be shared online. Having student work be able to be completed and shared online without face-to-face interaction, and having some sort of virtual space that you set up to communicate with each other when you face-to-face isn't possible. And then in this case, using those face-to-face, not to teach a whole class, but to do a very specific kind of interaction. This would maybe be doing small group teaching, which is sort of based on the British tutoring model, where students work with some material and then they come together in a small group led by a tutor who talks to them about what it is they've been reading, they've been experiencing, they've been learning about. And doing those in small groups, you could even do a small group for half of one course period and another small group for another half, the end of that period, divide them into like 4 cohorts. But letting go of that idea that everybody together in one room is what the face-to-face interaction has to be. So thinking about a different model. This is very much the same, except that it's focused on for courses where you're doing a lot of group work. And so doing as much as you can online and doing that as well as you can with the tools that you have and the spaces that are available to you. Making sure that you've come up with some really tools in conversation, probably with your students, for groups to collaborate and interact online, because they're going to have to do some of their group work that way. But then using the face-to-face time for group work, specifically for student groups to come together and work with you present, maybe to advise, to give input, but really what it is to give them that time that they need to get their group projects done. And then another variation upon this is for classes that just have really intense, maybe lab experiences, hands-on experience, studio experiences. Again, do everything you can online, use the face-to-face to facilitate those kinds of unique experiences to those courses that really can't be completed online. And then the last model was what I call the flexible learning community, which is really basically like throw all the rules out because you're ready for this, and come to your class with a really open mind about what it could be and work with your students to develop a model, talking through the affordances of face-to-face, the affordances of online, and thinking about what kind of work they want to accomplish in those different spaces and how they can do it in ways that feel safe and feel supportive and feel like they can be successful. All of those slides have more information. Obviously, I didn't read you all the details, but you're welcome to look at those afterwards. Robin mentioned that the framework for HiFlex with a Y is basically, look, we gave you Zoom cameras, so go for it. We knew that that was not the kind of framework we wanted for our faculty as they were diving into the fall. So we did actually develop this. This is the ACE framework. Robin will probably drop the link to it in the chat. This was a framework around 3 values: adaptability, connection, and equity that we developed last summer, and we put together these what we call ACE-informed practices at 3 different levels: the assignment level, the course level, the institution level. Each of these practices are ways for faculty to dive deeper into preparing for their fall semester, well, for their work, but at that point for their fall semesters, with values being at the forefront of that design as opposed to technology or even modality, really emphasizing the need for making sure that you are building courses that are flexible and adaptive to students' needs, that help students connect not only with each other, but with their communities large, and bring the world and the lives that they're experiencing into the classroom, particularly at a time when it's really hard to see the boundaries between your life and your work and your school. And so we need to find a way to honor that. And finally, to really embrace equity and justice in terms of the work that we're doing with students. You're welcome to dive a little deeper into the ACE framework if that's something you're interested in. But that really was designed just as a way to prepare our faculty going into the fall term. So now I want to talk a little bit about, okay, we did this work. We spent a lot of our summer thinking about this, talking with faculty, trying to prepare them. How did it go? And some of the lessons that we learned and that came out of it that might be helpful for folks who are grappling with these transitions now or even into the future. This is a quote from Laura Goggia that I really like. This is about HiFlex, and it's the original HiFlex design. And she's talking about how, HiFlex was developed by Beatty way before COVID. It's not a COVID model. And he developed it as an instructor in a graduate program for students in instructional technology, highly motivated students with pretty deep technical skills and an interest in getting better at those things. Not necessarily the students who we teach in all of our various fields and disciplines and programs at your schools, at our school. And so that colors, of course, the students' experience of this and how successful they're going to be. So it's really important, I think, to remember that if you start with this work and you feel like this isn't going the way that I hoped it would, that's not because of you necessarily. That's because you are teaching in an incredibly difficult, in an incredibly difficult moment, in an incredibly difficult way that is more than likely incredibly unfamiliar to you. And so some of what I'm going to share now are sort of the things that our faculty shared with us based on their experiences. So again, the first one is be realistic. HiFlex is not for everyone. It does not solve every problem. It can be helpful, and it can certainly help us get through a crisis. That does not necessarily mean it's the thing we all want to continue to be doing when this is over. Be intentional. Again, I use this word a lot. Modality, any choice about modality should be intentional. Understand what what online provides you with, what face-to-face provides you with, what hybrid provides you with. Make choices about what you're going to do in your courses based on those affordances, not because you're going to arrive at some perfect solution, but because when we're intentional with our choices, we are more likely to be successful than if we pick something just because someone told us that's what you should do. Letting go of the expectation of sameness. Robin mentioned this, and this is kind of built into the original HiFlex model, which is that in order to achieve the goals that they or you or collectively you've set out for them in a course, students don't all need to do the same things. They can do different things and still learn in ways that are, I wouldn't say equal, but at least equitable. And so giving students options of ways to complete the work, of ways to get through the course isn't a bad thing. So letting go of if you have if you really feel bogged down in this notion that everybody's got to do the same thing in the same way at the same time on the same schedule, maybe letting go of that a little bit not only will be freeing for your students, but freeing for you as well. This one was actually something Robin proposed that I really love, because I've always been doing faculty support and instructional design for years. And I always like to say that the reason I like my work is because it makes me feel like an event planner sometimes, which I actually would not be a very good event planner. But I love the idea that teaching is a little bit like planning an event. It's not like a play with a script, right? Where everybody plays out a role. It's more like, I'm going to throw up some decorations and I'm going to provide some great food and some games and activities for people to do. And then we'll see what happens, and we'll see who connects and where people land up. And it's always a little bit unexpected. So I love that idea of teaching in that way. But Robin was talking even more intentionally about planning your classes as events, where some events are online, some events are face-to-face, maybe some events are hybrid. What kind of teaching works better in those different kinds of events, and then giving students the option of picking and choosing the events that they're going to attend, so to speak, in order to achieve the goals of your class. So if event planning and the idea of setting up a calendar like that appeals to you, that could be a really interesting way of approaching, kind of building a flexible approach. Planning is critical, and that's kind of Yeah, sure, Martha, planning is critical. Of course, we should all plan. But really what I'm getting at here is sometimes when we talk about planning in pedagogy, we focus so much on the course, we focus on the syllabus, the calendar. The dirty little secret, of course, is that none of us stick to our calendars 100%, and none of us cover everything on the syllabus, and that's fine. That's the reality of teaching. It's actually what I love about teaching. But there's another aspect of planning, which is your actual class sessions, right? So if you are going to do something that looks like traditional hybrid, where you have some students face-to-face, some students online, asynchronous, some online synchronous, if you are going to try and do that, it is possible. We have some faculty at PSU who actually did this pretty successfully. I think they may be different kinds of humans than I am, but they did manage to pull it off. If you're going to do that, you need to think about planning, not just for your course, but for each individual session. How is that going to play out? It doesn't mean scripting it down to the minute, but it does mean having some overarching plan for what are we going to try and get through? What activities are we going to do face-to-face? What are people going to do who are online? What resources do I need to have at my fingertips? What links do I need to be able to pull up at a moment's notice? There are links in this slide to 2 example kind of planning worksheets for doing that kind of planning. A lot of our faculty emphasize this, providing opportunities for students to check in or check up. Your students are just as challenged by this as you are. And so being in conversation with them about how it's going, what they need, what's working, what isn't, is a really important, I would say that's always important, but I would say particularly when you're making this kind of transition to something new, it's really important to build those opportunities in. I think the number one concern our faculty had, the number one place where they felt like they were failing was on this, because they were so used to being able to, in a face-to-face setting, build community. Doesn't happen overnight, doesn't necessarily happen in the first week, but by some point in the semester, you get to a place, hopefully in your class, where you feel like, oh, we're a little community, we're a little learning community. My students know each other, I know them, we know a little bit about each other, it feels safe. That can be really elusive when you are working not only in new modalities, but across different modalities. A couple of little things that I like to suggest. One of faculty member, I loved this idea, talked about how every course she started with introductions, not just the first day, not just the first week. So every course she would take 5-10 minutes, every class session, she'd take 5-10 minutes to have students answer a question, reintroduce themselves, tell something funny, show something that they have on their desk, just little ways of building human connection into those sessions. Turning over the chat, for example, if you're using Zoom, to a couple of students and saying, you know what, you guys are in charge of the chat today. I want you to answer questions, ask questions, take notes, share animated GIFs, whatever it is you want to do, giving up a little piece of the classroom to them, so to speak. Playing games, anything sort of fun, even silly, to just break down a little bit of those technically mediated barriers that sometimes people who are new and unfamiliar in those spaces can really feel flummoxed by. Flexibility is key. Everything you plan, be prepared to change. Be prepared to rethink, be willing to change and rethink. Talk to your students about those changes explicitly. Talk to them about your teaching explicitly. And that brings me to this last one, which I don't think we talk about nearly enough, which is, I kind of alluded to this a second ago. As new as this is for us, it is also really new for our students. And they're dealing with maybe 3 to 5, 6 courses in a semester that are all being taught by different people, doing it a little bit differently with slightly different tools and different expectations and different personalities. The students who I talked to absolutely struggled with that, and recognizing that, acknowledging that, I think is so important in the work that we do. And some of that means being really intentional in talking to our students about what it means to learn this way, being explicit about what they should expect from different parts of the course, how the spaces of your classes are organized. Don't assume that they're going to be able to find things, because if every professor is organizing their course a little bit differently, imagine how complex and complicated that can be. And then imagine if you're a student who maybe has some sort of learning disability or accessibility concern, layer those things on top of each other, and suddenly you can see why students are struggling. So what can you do from where you sit to sort of alleviate some of that? Talk to them about how you would recommend they organize their time, how you would recommend they approach getting the work of the class done, giving them a model weekly schedule if you're teaching, with a lot of online components where they need to be individually kind of self-driven to get the work done. Talk about what participation looks like. This is my very favorite conversation to have with students. If you grade participation, having a conversation with students about what is participation is really interesting. And you might be surprised by the things that they say. And most importantly, what should students do if they're struggling? Let them know. Don't leave it up to them to figure that out. Tell them and say it again and again. If you're struggling, come talk to me, send me an email, drop into the tutoring center, set up a meeting on Zoom with me, whatever it is, just let them know what that is really explicitly. And now I'm going to turn it back over to Robin.
So really the main gist here is that no technology is inherently flexible or affords flexibility. That doesn't come from the tools. That comes from the reason that you use the tools, and that intentionality is what will shape your course. So what we really want to ask faculty to do is to take a step back from the tools and ask yourself, what is it that's important about this context and how I design for it? And to use that as a way to start shaping your course. We also believe, I'm not a fan of the silver lining of COVID narrative, especially as I sit here in my room with COVID. I will tell you the silver lining is even harder to see when you actually have COVID. But one thing that is clear is if you talked to a lot of students who really struggled. For example, we had a student worker who was very instrumental in shaping a lot of the ACE framework, and she had previously been homeless and struggled a lot with food insecurity. And one of the things she said consistently as we were all reeling from the shock of COVID is, this has already been this hard for me all along. And one of the things we can do with COVID is take the fact that while lots of individuals already knew the challenges in dealing with higher education when you're dealing with a crisis, what's happened through COVID and the fact that it was like a mass, had a mass effect, is that we're starting to see the systems starting to respond a little bit. And if we can think systemically about how we want to change design to deal with students who are in crisis, or to deal with our own set of crises, or a regional or national or global crisis, the fact is that we have an opportunity to kind of rethink why we want to do that work. So what we're really suggesting is, don't keep on as if we're in a global pandemic, because once we're vaccinated, hopefully we won't be in one. So we don't encourage you to, and this is actually a challenge at our own institution, where some administrators are really pushing HiFlex, because now they're like, oh, great, everybody can teach this way, and we only need to have one French teacher across 7 campuses because everybody can just HiFlex right into it. Faculty need to push back against some of that narrative, because lots of the pedagogical after effects of HiFlex are not great. What's beneficial is that it showed us how valuable flexibility is, why adaptability matters, how much students yearn for connection and how much they miss it when it's gone, and how accessibility counts. How many of our students are going to fall off the map of our class and our institution if we don't think about making the future an accessible future. So we think that there's a lot of good stuff baked into what we've learned over the last few months that we're trying to pull out without calling that HiFlex, or even worse, calling that Zoom, because I'm telling you, it's not Zoom that helps your students succeed. It's you and what you know about designing your environments. So with that, we will stop sharing our screen. I do want to tell you that the slide deck I have put into the chat, it's openly licensed. So, you know, if you want to share the slide deck or use some of those slides or whatever, there's also some notes built into the slide deck that you can check out when you have more time. But I think we have, you know, half an hour for conversation, and Martha and I are really happy to both answer questions, but also, you know, just hear from you some of your impressions of this. So Lori, shall I let you kind of moderate here? Would that be helpful? Or
Sure, that's fine. Actually, and what would work well is if anyone wants to unmute yourself, or if you want to post something in the chat, I'll watch the chat, but since we're not a huge group, you can unmute yourself. Maybe, you know, even share some examples. What does participation look like to you in your HiFlex classes so far? What questions or comments do you have? What things are working well? What things are you still frustrated with? Or have you experienced that your faculty are frustrated with? So I'm going to take that minute to let that pregnant pause happen. Yeah, you've got
the hand raised there. Nadir, I don't know if that's how you say your name.
Nader.
Nader?
Nader.
Yeah, great.
Well, thank you for this presentation. Actually, I have a few questions, and I don't want to take too long here, but our college, I'm from Stark State College in North Canton, Ohio, and we actually had the same idea or the principle or the concept of being flexible before the COVID. And one of my colleagues, I teach in the engineering department, and we had classes that they were offered during the day, and his cohort were actually more workers, and they work in the evening, but the class was surveying, so they needed the daylight to do the surveying. So he came up with this flexible format, and that evolved to, you know, basically being in the college as far as flexible. And the way we have it is we have face-to-face, Web 2, which is basically the hybrid, once in the, you know, in the classroom and once or then asynchronous. Mm-hmm. And then we have the Web 3, which is completely asynchronous. That was what has been for a while. So part of the format was, again, the principle is flexible. So when the COVID hit, of course, we all had to go online between asynchronous and synchronous and so forth. And in the fall, we kind of like developed that option. But then something somehow complaints, Higher Learning Commission, you know, Ohio Department of Higher Education, which is part of my question, is that we had to give the students, for the flexible format, we have to give them how flexible it is, which in a way kind of contradicts the whole concept. So long story short, just 2 weeks ago, actually, you know, part of our, you know, process of changing policy and whatnot, you know, is they come up with, and the policy passed, they come up with actually 6 sub-designations of the flexible format. Mm-hmm. And it's like, again, it's like every time I talk about it, it's like, you know, does that make sense? Even am I saying it correctly? You know, but I mean, it's like, I mean, doesn't that defeat the purpose of being flexible? You know, now I understand, again, from administration standpoint, why, because apparently they had a lot of different complaints from the students in the admission office, is that, you know, when they asked that question, said you have to contact your faculty. Well, you know, the faculty usually is only a week beforehand, you know, is in the term, you know, and sometimes even the online, they don't open the courses till maybe like first day of class, and they don't know what to expect. And again, you know, all of this somehow didn't work. So now they actually have these subcategories. And I don't know how you feel about it. You know, I saw Martha roll her eyes. and the other part is, you know, was there any red tape like in New Hampshire as far as like the higher learning, you know, the Department of Higher Education, or like you have to be more specific of how flexible? Or
I'll answer a little bit of that, and then I'm going to throw it to Martha so she can explain her eyeballs. But I will say during COVID, there was not pushback. And what we heard even from, we have some very highly accredited programs where what we call seat time is a very significant part of their accreditation, and you can't just, you know, change things like that willy-nilly. What we heard from accrediting agencies during COVID, and also from our regional accreditors, like institutional accreditors for up here in New Hampshire, we have NETCHI, that everybody was very flexible and understanding during COVID. Now, the question of whether that would continue is the big question. And what we have absolutely seen, to your point, is many institutions are starting now. You used to have like online, hybrid, and face-to-face. Now you'll see a menu of like 14 different modalities that are offered to students, which can actually be really confusing and overwhelming. I don't think we have arrived at the answer to this dilemma, because even though most of us can look at that list and see that it's too granular and it doesn't afford the kind of emergent flexibility that we're talking about, on the other hand, students can feel like they didn't get the straight story if they sign up for a course and then the modality shifts, especially because you'll hear from lots of students, oh, I can't do online. Like I'll fail if I go online. So I think we have to have, you know, some kind of happy medium between transparency with students so they know what they're paying for and what they're signing up for, along with the ability to be flexible. What I'd love to see is the ability for students to choose some kind of a flexible modality. So maybe it's got, you know, it tells you upfront which synchronous things will be required, because you have to know if it conflicts with your work schedule, you can't take that class, right? So it would tell you that, but then you wait until you get in the course and you're able to sort of mini register inside the course for different, you know, weeks or experiences or whatever. I feel like what the main things that people have trouble for at the level of like state governance, accreditation, or even administrators is concern over workload and seat time. But that's been a concern even with hybrid and online, like the fact that we still call things a credit hour in a fully asynchronous online course. We just don't talk about the fact that that doesn't actually really make any sense. So I think you're just seeing that come to the forefront a little bit more in these blended modalities where you can track students who are face-to-face very easily. And those online students then seem like they might be getting away with something because you can't, you know, prove their engagement in exactly the same way. But I think a lot of the accreditors are now moving more to these outcomes oriented. You're seeing this even with competency-based education, where what matters is what you learn and how you learn it. So it's a very complicated question and I don't think anybody's really worked it out. You want to jump into, Martha?
I don't have much more to add to that. Mostly my eye roll, well, you can probably imagine where my eye rolling came from, but it's a little, what it sounds to me like is that, you know, you had a situation that was mostly a communication issue, right, with students about expectations and information. And rather than solving the communication issue, which is a different kind of solution, they instead made a very complex solution that may actually not benefit your students and may make it harder for your faculty. That doesn't surprise me. I think that happens all the time at our institutions, but it just makes me sad because it sounds like you had a good working model.
There are two schools of thought on this part about the confusion or not. You know, I have to actually give credit to the way it was vetted. You know, they actually have vetted it through the faculty, you know, through the divisions and the departments, and they asked them what flexibility model that you actually follow. You know, what is your flexibility when you say it's Web 4? You know, that's basically was the only designation, right. W4. Okay, so based on that feedback, they came up with about 6 or 7 actually different, you know, collections, and that's what they proposed. You know, and I think, you know, when, you know, we do this through the president's cabinet, you know, and basically we actually took one out because, you know, we merged one with 2, so less is better, you know, the subcategories. And but I think the way it was collected was actually pretty good, because
Yeah.
they took it from the faculty. What do you do in your flexibility? Even though I was one of them that said, I don't think any of these designations exactly describes how I do it, but they told me, because I do like 50% face-to-face and 50% synchronous. That's what I was looking for. There was no such a designation.
Yeah.
But they say like mostly this and mostly that.
Yeah, get as close as possible. Yeah.
And so yeah, I think it's the communication or the concerns from the student standpoint, that the students complain that that's not what we expected. They're concerned about dropping and whatnot, because they thought like, oh, it says W, that means it's a web, so
Right.
we don't have to be in class. Oh, I have to be in class? I didn't know
Yeah.
that. Well, it says that it's Monday, Wednesday, 10 o'clock, so yes, you should be in class, whether it's synchronous or in person. So there is like time designation even for that one, which actually makes it a little bit, more. But again, that's the part. And I see
Yeah.
Kayla here, my colleague, unmuted herself. She probably wanted to say something about this.
Hi, yeah, I teach at the same college as Natter does. I kind of just wanted to say a couple of things. So in the fall, and so last fall, I did have to do a lot of what you were talking about, where I was required, we didn't have enough social distancing space in our classrooms. So we ended up teaching all of these classes millions of times a week. That's an exaggerated.
That's what it felt like, though.
But it kind of felt like it, right? Because instead of giving them their lecture in their lab, sorry guys, you only get lab. I have to get through it in an hour and 50 minutes and then boot you out the door because I have to move on to the next class that I only get to see you with and teach you one day a week. So I honestly, truly did feel very bad for those students that were hoping to get the lecture, the lab, because some of those students need that in class lab time. So I did offer, and what I started doing in the fall was for those students that wanted to come again, and if I had the space, I let them come to the classroom if I had the social distancing space, but I also did a lot of Zoom where I gave them the feed to the live classroom through Zoom, and then they could, if they had Photoshop or whatever it was at home, then they could be at home with their Photoshop and they could get the lecture again, or they could get the opportunity to ask questions or see what's happening. And then I was recording them. And it's so interesting that this never came up before, to use kind of like collaborate. We have Blackboard or Zoom to record your live lectures like that. And I keep my webcam off. They don't need to see, they don't want to see my face, and I don't want to show my face anyways. But I have had such positive feedback over the last semester and this semester with how much they can go back. And they're like, oh, I forget what you said, or I forget how to do this, or I forget what this means. So I'm going to go back and watch it. I can't believe the amount of feedback that they love it. And so I definitely think moving forward, that aspect will be something that I keep. And then I just upload the lecture to, either to YouTube or Blackboard and put it right in there. But this semester has been interesting because to Natter's point, we had, and to Martha, what you were saying about our communication issue is we were all running our classes very differently this semester. So for admissions to say, oh, you're a Web 4, that didn't fit with our old definition of what a Web 4 was, because my students still had to come to class, whether it was virtual or face-to-face, at the time that was on their schedule. But Web 4s, sometimes you don't have to show up to class online at that time. So we really did need a definition of how we were running our Web 4s, because it would be impossible for admissions to tell every single student, they don't know how I'm going to teach that class. But this semester, I only have one student that comes to class every Monday, Wednesday. The rest are all on Zoom. And it's just amazing to me that nobody wanted to come to class. I mean, so they all want, and they love the Zoom environment. They're like, I can be at home, I can have you here, I can have the software up here. So it has definitely been an interesting roller coaster of a ride and a huge learning curve the last few semesters. So thank you for your presentation. Kind of validating what I think a lot of us have been doing over the last few semesters. I'll stop talking now.
Well, you're just making me think of so many things, Kayla, but particularly I'm thinking about the learning management system, Blackboard, or whatever you have where you are, and how, and Martha and I are both people who often work outside of the learning management system. I'll put it that way, euphemistically. But one of the things that's interesting about the LMS is that it can do a pretty good job helping students navigate their day. Like, here's what I got to do. It's all in one place. I come here, I do this. But with this kind of modality shifting, I could imagine, and I hope that Blackboard and Canvas and, you know, all the other learning management systems, I hope they kind of wake up to the fact that people are starting to be more flexible about modality. Because wouldn't it be great if Blackboard or Canvas or Moodle helped your students really understand where they needed to be and when, and it was easy for you. Like, you can imagine somebody creating a home screen when you log into your class that would make it, and you know, I haven't designed this, so I don't know what it looks like, but I could imagine something calendar-like looking that helps them really keep track of the online async work, the online synchronous work, and that you would, you know, be able to have that. One of the problems right now, and this is what Martha and I love to do, but most faculty don't love to do it. They like to teach chemistry, you know, or whatever they actually teach, is that we have to do all that work ourselves, right? We have to be the ones that are really directing our students to all of these different kinds of engagements. And depending on your skill and also how much time you have, not only in your life, like God help you if you got little kids at home or, you know, whatever, but also just, you know, some people, like in the fields that I teach a lot about education. It's easy for me to take a whole week to talk about, here's how we're redesigning the experience of education. But some people who are teaching, for example, athletic training, and they've got a standardized athletic training test, they just want to get right to their content. Mm-hmm. So it takes a lot of time to help students learn how to navigate all of these different experiences. So it may be that we get some more tools in the coming months as our ed tech industry realizes that many of us are starting to experiment with this stuff. And as you guys know from community college, you know, I did quite a bit of work with a college called College Unbound in Rhode Island, and they serve only adult learners who have dropped out of college previously. So almost all of them are working adults. They're almost all people of color, and they're all Pell eligible students. That whole college, you know, functions around the principle of flexibility, because none of these people could be going back to school if they weren't highly flexible learning environments. So for all of us, you know, in this room right now, I think we're realizing that it can, if we can figure out the secret sauce of helping fit our courses into the real lives of our students, we're going to be able to retain a lot more students, get a lot more students through to completion or conversion to four-year degrees or whatever. So I think the stakes are high, but we don't have a lot of tools that are helping us organize this right now. You're all making it up as you go, and it's not easy.
I was just going to say, I'm a really big believer that that we teach, there are things that we teach in our classes that are, well, this isn't a radical statement. There are things that we teach in our classes that aren't on the syllabus, and that what our students, oftentimes what our students get out of their educational experience isn't actually the stuff that we're putting on a syllabus or measuring or counting. And it reminds me of, I had a thread about this on Twitter the other day about, I think I was talking about how I very frequently work with people who get really frustrated that students, why do my students want to have everything? They'll say, why do they want to have everything handed to them? They just want to check things off a list. Why is that the case? And then I'll go into meetings where the administration will be like, this is awesome. We have this new tool for students that will let them manage their education by checking things off a list. And then you'll be like, well, maybe the reason why students think that education is about checking things off a list is because we keep telling them that that's what it is. So I actually think a lot of what we do in our classrooms, I know we all love our fields and our disciplines and we care about the content that we teach, but ultimately I look at, like, my kids, I have a high schooler, and I look at their experience in high school right now. And what I care about is them learning how learning works, like how their education works and how they move themselves into the person who they want to become through their education and through the work at school. And so when I think about this in terms of technology and about, a lot of times people will be like, well, we can't fragment students' experience too much. We want to use the same tools. So they all go to the same place. They find things all in one place. It's all very predictable. They'll be more successful that way. And first of all, I will say that I completely agree during a global pandemic that we should keep things as simple as possible, and we should do everything we can to do that, to simplify as much as possible. However, outside of that context, I think part of what we can do for our students is help them to become more agile, more adaptive users of these spaces. And part of that is being exposed to a lot of different kinds of experiences that they then have to learn how to integrate for themselves. Now, that said, I also think we need to be really generous in that work with them. That shouldn't be punitive work, right? That shouldn't be, oh, you didn't get that turned in on time because you didn't know where to find it, you fail. I think that needs to be work that we're constantly returning to and talking to them about, not just, are you learning the content of my class, but are you understanding how your education is shaped, how all of these experiences that you're having are in conversation with each other, how these tools are related or not related, what these spaces do or don't do. Being more intentional in our conversations about that, I think, is really a meaningful part of the work that we should be doing with students. And I think it's more and more important because, I don't know, I don't want my students to graduate into a world where every workplace, and I don't think they will, every workplace uses all the same tools in all the same ways. And I mean, that's not a good future for us as humans. Technology is hard and it's complicated, but complexity is sometimes better than standardization that then limits us or empowers certain entities in ways that are not good. So I feel like that tension is something we need to continue to grapple with. I don't know if that was related to anything that Kayla said, but.
Well, it's interesting though. You're really talking about flexibility for the students as well, right? Yeah. We're focused on what we can do as faculty to help our students by us being more flexible. And we need our students to learn that flexibility isn't important. Checking things off a list is great and it is important, but they also, in this day and age, they need to be just as flexible as we are, and they need to help learn to learn
flexibility. And to follow up on that, Lori, flexibility is not something that you're born into. It's actually a skill you develop. It's a muscle that you work. You get better at it. And we need to, in our work with students, see that as something that they have to develop and not expect them to be able to do it right out of the gate. But it's something we need to keep returning to and talking with them about and recognizing when they're successful at it.
Yeah, I think this is part of the reason why Martha and I have both through the course of our careers become more and more interested in grading and in what we call ungrading, because we've been interested in the way that these binary systems like a pass-fail system or an AF system sort of, that subverts a lot of what we're talking about right now, right? Because flexibility is basically about instead of failing when you hit a challenge, you shift and adapt, right? But most educational environments traditionally have been built around, you hit a roadblock, you get a bad grade. We don't actually even worry about that. We just go on, and we know most of us don't teach that way, but that's kind of the symbolics of the model. So, thinking about, a lot of professors, I think, call themselves student-centered or flexible, but one of the pieces of ACE that you'll find if you look in there, it's called the cruelty-free syllabus. And a colleague of ours, Matthew Cheney, basically went through all the parts of a syllabus to ask the question, what are the values that are embedded in each of these parts of the syllabus, so many of which we just stick in there because we've been doing it for 20 years. Some of it's even required by the institution. We don't even ask, we just put it in there. Here's my grading rubric, here's this, here's that. And he really broke it down and said, like, what what messages are we delivering to students with the ways that we sort of set up these environments? And I think it's a lot of what COVID is asking us to do is to unbuild a little bit. And when we rebuild, to be much more intentional about asking what is the value that undergirds the decision that I'm making now. Because if you want flexible learning, it's a little bit hard at the same time to have a very strict pass-fail environment, because, you know, if failure is the end point, there's no room for flexibility, right? I do see we're getting short on time, but we would be super happy to answer a final question or hear a final comment. I know lots of folks are still with us, which is great.
Nobody actually wants to say. I have a technical question, if again, but I will yield to somebody else who wants to ask another question. Anyone? Okay. What do you do? I have actually a situation where the software is not available to the students. The software that we need to use is only available on campus. And there was sort of like a dilemma between our IT people and the software developers, that, to give access and not to access. I have access because I go through a VPN and I can actually access that software in my classroom. And I don't know exactly, last year when we shut down completely for the COVID, I actually, shelved it, and we went and basically used the spreadsheet. It's an estimating, by the way. It's a construction estimating with a database. So what we did is we just, I created, a spreadsheet. I gave them the spreadsheet to just like enter your items in a spreadsheet like this, and we're done. But the outcomes, of course, that they need to learn something professional. So my question is, aside from dumping that software, do you have any other, ideas that, like I couldn't hold it, actually, I cannot hold it like flexible right now. That's the only class I don't teach flexible, because every class, every session, we have to use that software. And the student actually use it. And it's available only in one room in the entire campus, one classroom.
Yeah.
So, any suggestions?
I'm sure this will not solve the problem, and Martha may have more sort of tech solutions, but my other big job that I have that I work on is on open education, which is not just openly licensed textbooks, which is what you usually hear for open education. We call it OER, Open Educational Resources. And these are free digital textbooks that you can download and print or, disseminate. But OER is also a whole bunch of other stuff, including simulations and labs and, whatever other learning materials. But a lot of people who advocate for OER also advocate for open platforms and open technologies. The movement in general suggests that anything that we need for learning should be openly available and accessible. And what we have now are practitioners in every field, including in the trades, folks like Chad Flynn, for example, in electrical and plumbing, has done a lot of big work out in British Columbia on this. Because it's especially hard in the trades with manuals, and sometimes those are even proprietary. So during COVID, lots of big companies and systems allowed people to use their software for free, students in particular. So the first thing is, like, IT should always check on that stuff during a global pandemic, because there were a lot of people willing to do that. Part of the reason they did that is because it builds up a dependency on a for-profit tool that they then think you'll buy later. So really what I suggest is, if you have something like that, you may not be able to change right away, but if you're not hooked up with Open Educational Resources community, come through me or somebody else and find folks in your discipline who are working on open, because I can almost guarantee that the work that you do in production are both resources, but also platforms, tools. Like, for example, in math, it's not just about a math textbook. You need the, LaTeX, platforms that allow the students to do the homework sets. These are all being developed in openly licensed resources, so that your students, as long as they had the internet and a device, could access them from anywhere. So I suggest that we use COVID as a wake-up call. And, if you're on a very slow timeline, take 2 or 3 years and convert your courses from commercial resources to open resources. The people who will help you with this are primarily librarians and instructional designers. So if you have access to either one of those folks, start there, because in every field, these materials are being developed. It's possible they don't have exactly what you need yet, but if you put that into the community, I believe they'll start coming. And actually, Garrett is putting in here in the chat from the Success Center. So she's got her survey about the session today, but she is a great person to talk to about open educational resources and open platforms, because in your state there is a lot of work being done, and they may be able to provide you some resources.
Thank you.
Yeah, and there is work being done through OACC, as Robin said, and we've had Robin talk about OERs as well, and that's a great combination, a great way to combine the HiFlex design aspect with open educational resources as well. I think we are.
Section, I just want to say there is a section of the ACE framework specifically on OER. So if you use that old ACE link, you can go in there and click on the OER section to kind of get started with those questions.
That's great. Final comments, Robin, Martha?
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And also, I've been fond of saying, like, it's not so much post-pandemic with a dash, but like post-pandemic, meaning we're going to be living with the repercussions, the grief, the challenges, and the inequities of COVID for a really long time. So any of those lessons that you can pull forward into your design, I think are going to serve especially our most vulnerable students really well. And our community colleges are on the front lines of that work. So I think this is really where most of the innovation is going to happen. And the CCs need to be our national leaders, I think, in what higher ed starts to look like. Yeah, it's going to be the future, I hope, of people paying attention to serving students better.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And I think the opportunities for improving our communication with our students about what the courses are being offered and how we're offering them is going to be more critical than ever. And the models that were provided by Robin and Martha and all of the links that you see in the chat, I think will be helpful for everyone. So with that, thank you all for your participation. We appreciate you being here, and we absolutely appreciate Robin and Martha joining us. So enjoy the rest of your week, and Robin, stay healthy, get healthier. Take care.